Well, the Defence Secretary concluding a very lengthy news conference talking about it being a dangerous moment in the Middle East. He said it had been difficult days for the Department of Defence since Sunday's attack, which killed 3 service personnel in Jordan. Then there was that lengthy apology about that controversy about his hospital visit, being treated for prostate cancer, which of course the president was not told about. He apologised to the American president, to his team and the public. He gave a long explanation, but he said it was an explanation, not an excuse. We're listening to all of that. Nick Beake is in Jerusalem for us. Nick, let's return to the many comments he made on the potential US retaliatory action. Obviously minimal details, but what we've learnt is that the attacks over a number of days, there'll be a series of attacks, they'll be inside Iraq and Syria, and crucially not inside Iranian territory itself.
Yeah, Matthew, I thought it was really interesting listening to the US's top defence official there, outlining how the White House sees Iran as stirring things up in the Middle East. We've already heard from one of his colleagues how this part of the world faces a danger it hasn't seen for some 50 years. And Lloyd Austin there was making clear that he believed Iran was responsible for this through funding and supporting various groups across this region. Chiefly, some of the groups that have been operating within Syria and Iraq. And of course, he said that it didn't really matter how much Iran knew about that specific attack at the weekend in which 3 American service personnel were killed. He said the fact that Iran are giving weapons and giving backing to these groups means that Iran is responsible, and that's why Iranian targets will be looked at in the coming hours and days at a time of America's choosing, he was saying. But yes, you're right, there will be no strikes on Iranian soil. I think that was always seen as highly unlikely. The White House saying they don't want a wider conflict, they don't want to exacerbate things, but they do have to send a message. And of course, that sending a message extends to a few different things in the Middle East at the moment, notably the Houthi rebels who have been firing from within Yemen out towards the Red Sea. They say they've been hitting ships which are linked to Israel, the US, the UK, and they've been doing this in solidarity with the people of Gaza. And they say they'll continue to hit shipping until the fighting stops and Israeli forces withdraw. Clearly, there's no sign of that happening at the moment. So there are concerns that with more military activity in the Middle East about escalation, but certainly America is setting out how it will respond after those deadly attacks at the weekend. But they say they do it in a calculated manner, at the same time sending a message to Iran that this sort of activity from their proxies will not be tolerated. Matthew.
Nick Beake there in Jerusalem. Thanks very much for the perspective where you are. Let's go back to Washington to our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman, who was listening to all of that. And Tom, what was your assessment?
Well, let's talk about Iran first of all, because what is new today is that our colleagues at CBS News reporting that the approval has been given for strikes over a series of days, and crucially on Iranian personnel and facilities, but not inside Iran itself. Now, I think there's 2 things behind this. The fact that this information is now coming out, because what we heard from Lloyd Austin, as they always say, they're not going to sort of telegraph their military action. They're not going to speculate before it happens on exactly where it may be targeted. That's the very sort of public from the podium line. But this information is now coming out obviously from elsewhere in the administration, because I think what they want to do is to show to the Iran hawks here in Washington that they are going to respond decisively. It is coming, but they're kind of keeping things in a holding pattern, because people will be asking the question, well, why haven't there been any military strikes already since these 3 soldiers were killed at the weekend? So I think there's one thing to say about the targeting, and that is it's very notable that this does not mention Iran itself. That's what some Iran hawks here want to see, but it does talk about Iranian personnel and facilities in Iraq and Syria. Now, that is still would be a very, very considerable action. There are Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, Iranian personnel in parts of Iraq and Syria. So the targeting of them by the US would be significant. That is supposed to meaningfully deter further strikes against US personnel. But the fact is, the reported approval here doesn't appear to be against Iran itself. They're trying not to draw in Tehran into a wider confrontation, direct action between the US and the Iranians. And I think it's important here that they've also mentioned the weather, and I think they talk about cloud cover. I think there is a suggestion this perhaps hasn't happened so far because they haven't got the weather to guarantee the targeting. That's a kind of sidebar mention towards those more hawkish members of Congress that I mentioned. They're perhaps suggesting this is why it hasn't happened yet.
Really briefly, Tom, I mentioned there a really lengthy apology for that hospital stay, that cancer diagnosis that he'd had, but he'd kept it from his department, the public and the president. He went a great length to go through the detail of all of that. This, I think, the first news conference he's actually had since all of that controversy blew up.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time he's been at the Pentagon publicly since all of this. This has been this has put huge pressure on Joe Biden during, the biggest military conflagration in the Middle East, in many, many years that he's been, this crisis that he's been trying to deal with. He's had his own defense secretary, literally taking part in calls about operational activity from his hospital bed. And this has put huge pressure on an issue of transparency, of accountability, because, the senior level of the administration didn't know about the fact he was hospitalised at the start. So we had this very, very lengthy apology, a very, very lengthy explanation, as he put it, as to why he hadn't told the president at the start. And he said he was very sorry for that. It's been a very difficult episode, both for the White House and for the Pentagon during this very serious crisis in the Middle East.
Yes, he said, I did not handle this right, and I apologise. Tom Bateman there at the State Department, thanks very much for the latest. Thank you.